On May 17, 1999, dispatchers in Jacksonville, Florida, receive a panicked call from the affluent Deerwood residential community.
Jacksonville 911, KL. Okay, ma'am, listen, you got to calm down for us to get you some help. First of all, do you need police or do you need rescue?
Police, they stole our money.
It was a very frantic call. They had some difficulty understanding her, but they were able to establish that they were the victim of what appeared to be a home invasion robbery, and her husband was assaulted.
They stabbed him to death. He's bleeding.
Who stabbed him?
Somebody, I don't know, woman Atlantic said that he was leaving the house with his van. They stopped him and let him inside the house. I'm so proud to be there.
Let me ask you this. The person who stabbed him, is he gone?
Yes, they left.
They immediately sent patrol officers to the scene.
When officers arrive at the residence, they find the caller, Summer Kawaf, tending to her 39-year-old husband, Saad, inside the garage.
He was in critical condition at that point, with severe stab wounds all over his body.
He was life-flighted as our medical air ambulance service here to what was then University Medical Center, the Trauma One facility in town.
Officers did see that Samar had been involved in some type of altercation. There was blood on her clothes. She had duct tape in her hair.
She was then removed from the crime scene and taken to the Deerwood clubhouse. She was certainly emotionally wrought. She was concerned about her husband.
I remember when I received a call that a horrible incident has taken place and Saad is severely injured and he is being taken to the university hospital, and everybody was just shocked because I cannot imagine that anybody would have any animosity against a person like Saad.
It had been 17 years since Saad first left his home country of Syria for America in 1982.
The family was very educated. He had a brother who lived in Boston and he was professional. His other brother was a physician and he himself came as a student to do his bachelor degree in computer sciences at Florida Atlantic University, FAU, in Boca Raton. Initially, he worked in some kind of tech company in Hollywood area near close to Miami. That's where Summer, his wife, came and joined him from Syria, and they got married in Hollywood, South Florida.
Saad and Summer relocated from South Florida to Jacksonville in 1986 for a better opportunity.
At that time, the computer job was not that prevalent or not that good paying. So that's where they moved down to Jacksonville and purchased a convenience store. And then he put all of his efforts to become a very successful small business owner.
His business became very successful. They were making a lot of money with this particular business.
I knew Saad and Summer from the very beginning of my migration to Jacksonville. The president of Islamic Center of Northeast Florida, he invited me for dinner, and that's where I came across them. They became just like my family and friends. And he was regular for our congregational prayers, and he was very kind person, always smiling. And the next year in 1987, they had their daughter Layla. They lived in Deerwood, which was gated community, very affluent community.
Deerwood has a gorgeous golf course, swimming pool, tennis courts, club. It's a really nice area.
Saad was very close to his mother and his brother. So after a lot of communication between the family, the mother and the brother decided to move to Jacksonville to live closer to Saad. I mean, the way I look at Saad is that typical success story who came as an immigrant, who worked through different stages to become successful businessman, and who focused upon his business and upon his family and upon serving the community. So it was the shock of my life seeing somebody who is so kind, so caring, and such a person full of life being stabbed at his own home.
Within an hour of the 911 call, authorities received word that Saad Kawaf has succumbed to his injuries.
I remember rushing to the university hospital, and there I found almost everybody from the Muslim community or the Syrian community. It is horrible, it is unbearable. So the first question came to our mind is, who could have done it?
Homicide investigators soon arrive at the Kawaf residence.
Along with a significant amount of blood on the floor of the garage. There was blood splatter or transfer on the wall and then on the car, the Camry itself, which was indicative of a very violent fight and stabbing. In 1999, DNA was at its infancy at its time, so detectives are looking to gather any type of evidence from the garage and inside the house.
You have blood spatter in places. You have some blood droplets on the kitchen cabinet.
There was blood on the kitchen counter and I believe by the sink as well.
You've got blood everywhere. So it's incumbent upon the police to collect blood samples.
Inside a kitchen cabinet, investigators also find evidence to corroborate Summer Kawaf's story of the attack.
There were some bags where the money apparently was. In fact, one of the evidence photos shows a stack of bills in a bag, like maybe somebody missed that when they were scarfing up the rest of it.
So this confirmed that this was more than likely a home invasion robbery.
They didn't know if there was some random person that was going to various homes in that particular area. So they're on high alert.
Coming up, investigators uncover red flags in Saad Kawaf's life.
The victim was the subject of a federal and state investigation.
The assailants had inside information that the victim carried large amounts of money home.
This is a whole nother ballgame now.
And as the mystery deepens, the long road to justice leads to an unlikely pair.
You can't dispute the DNA. They match.
Just a few hours into the investigation of 39-year-old Saad Kawaf's murder, investigators in Jacksonville have little doubt about the killer's motive.
It was a robbery/homicide type incident. You had one victim that was deceased there, as well as a survivor, the wife of the deceased.
Now we need to figure out who possibly could have done this. Samara was distraught at what just occurred. The detectives start to interview her at the Deerwood Country Club. They ask her to start at the beginning of their day. She said they woke up like any other morning that day.
He was going to pick up his mother to take the mother to a doctor's appointment. Samara had just bid goodbye to her husband. She heard commotion in the garage.
It sounded like her husband was yelling.
She went out there and she saw a male suspect having a major scuffle with her husband, stabbing him.
There was a white female in the garage as well that immediately approached her and demanded money from her. She did not recognize these people, had never seen them before.
She immediately got into a struggle, and they then fell to the ground and struggled from the ground.
She fought off her attacker, and during her fighting off the attacker, she bit her assailant. She left a significant bite mark on her left arm.
The female assailant took Mrs. Kawaf inside the home to look for money.
And then in comes the male suspect holding a knife to her throat. And he demands money. He says, "I know you got it here."
The assailants kept asking for the deposits. They had inside information that Mr. Kawaf carried large amounts of money home.
Mr. Kwaf's business did a lot of work in lottery deposits and food stamps, and so he was holding on to large sums of money at a time.
So is there a co-worker at his convenience store that for some whatever reason would want to do this?
According to Summer, her husband had brought home more than $50,000 the previous night to keep safe until the bank opened on Monday morning.
And at that point, Mrs. Kwaf told them where a large sum of money in a paper bag was hidden in one of the kitchen cabinets.
After Mrs. Kwaf points it to them, she is then tied up in duct tape. Her mouth is sealed with duct tape. She is secured to a chair, and the male and female suspect leave.
Once the suspects left, she was able to get out of the duct tape and contacted 911 at that point. Her husband was still alive in the garage.
And his only words are, "I'm dying. Call police."
The female was described as being a white female, short blonde hair, well-dressed, and wearing a hat.
She didn't have much to say to describe the male assailant. He was a male, a white male.
She was not able to see how the suspects left the house, so there was no vehicle description at that time from her.
After they speak with Summer, investigators canvass the neighborhood.
We were looking for potential witnesses to the crime. And eventually detectives were able to speak to a resident in that neighborhood who routinely walks her dog. And right around the time this was occurring, she had noticed that there was a red Jeep Cherokee in that driveway.
It passed her, but she was not able to identify either of the occupants.
This is a gated community. It is a very affluent area, so everyone comes in has to register or be checked out.
They went to the guard service in the attempts of getting descriptions of all individuals that came in. There was no red Jeep on the logs whatsoever. So they may have thought, well, the lady was mistaken.
Investigators ask Saad's friends and family if any of his employees had a vendetta against the Kawafs.
His store was on Beach Boulevard in an area which was not very affluent.
The person that committed this crime knew the routine, knew that there was large deposits, knew that Mr. Kawaf carried those home with him.
Usually the money which the store does over the weekend, the bank is closed, so it is his habit that he will deposit it on Monday morning.
This is 1999. Cash is still pretty prevalent. ATM cards probably not that much. And this is a busy store in a busy, long-established neighborhood. Cash was probably king.
An employee might have known that Mr. Kwaf had this much money in his home. So they did go to the store.
They interviewed each of the employees individually to determine their relationship with the victim. Was there anything that would either lead them to believe that one of those workers is a potential suspect?
They checked their background, they checked their whereabouts, but all the employees had ironclad alibis, and none of them had done anything to raise suspicions of being involved in this homicide.
As investigators search for other potential leads, they discover a separate case tied to Saad's business dealings.
They learned that the victim was the subject of a federal and state investigation involving a potential money laundering scheme. This is a whole nother ballgame now. We potentially could have organized crime involved here, which opens up your possibilities exponentially of what could have occurred.
Is he selling drugs? Is he getting money for something else that he's not supposed to be doing?
So, as a detective, this quickly goes from being, is it a small group of individuals that knew what his daily routine was, to now the sky's the limit. Are there drug cartels involved?
Less than 6 hours after the murder of Saad Kawaf, investigators with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office have discovered he was the subject of a multi-jurisdiction investigation.
In the United States, if you make a bank deposit, $10,000 or more, it gets reported to the federal government. The victim was making cash deposits to his bank twice a week that were under the $10,000 mark.
It's going to throw a red flag if you're constantly making cash deposits on a regular basis under $10,000. It's going to get their attention, and it did. It raises the eyebrows of the government as how are you making the money? Is your business a front? Are you doing something illegal and you're bringing a lot of cash that you're not reporting?
And so he was reported by his bank to the authorities, and the matter was assigned to a task force.
2 days after his murder, a judge signs off on a search warrant for Saad Kawaf's home.
Detectives conducted a search warrant at his home. They found nothing. They found no drugs. They found nothing that would relate him to any type of money laundering.
It could have been simply a matter of trying to avoid paying taxes, but there might have been another reason for it.
It's very likely that deposits were made to the bank under that $10,000 mark on a regular basis, and that the remainder of the cash was kept at home to have that cash readily accessible.
With his store being where it was located in a low-income area, he has to have that cash because people are bringing checks there to cash them, and he would cash those checks for them. He's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to service the people in that particular area. They excluded the fact that he was involved in any kind of illegal activity, any type of money laundering.
Back at square one, investigators turn back to Saad's wife for help.
Unfortunately, in this case, there was no video evidence, nothing that would assist law enforcement in determining what the suspects looked like. Other than Samar's description, she was able to come up with a sketched image of what the female suspect possibly looked like.
So detectives provide to the community and the media a composite sketch of the female that was involved in this case, asking for anybody with any information as to who this may be.
The victim's family and friends provided a check for a $100,000 reward for any leads that would result in an arrest of the suspect.
The community was willing to do anything to find the culprit. I mean, the community was so much devastated. We would have done whatever, so 100,000 and even more than that would have not been an issue.
You have to understand, every call that comes in, they've got to follow up because there may be something in one of those calls that will lead them to the assailant.
For more than 2 months, investigators look into every tip they receive.
Some of them are just bogus calls, people trying to take a chance on giving information so that they can get $100,000 in reward.
That unfortunately, none of the leads that they were provided were of any value.
Investigators catch a small break when they receive the results from the crime lab on the evidence collected at the scene.
During the original processing of the scene, crime scene detectives were able to get blood samples from the victim's home that resulted in a foreign DNA hit.
Also, there was blood found on Mr. Kawaf's shirt collar, which was identified as being blood that wasn't his blood. So obviously it was believed that that blood was from the male assailant.
Unfortunately, the technology just wasn't available at that time to identify who they were. After several months, the case goes into suspension. So the last thing any detective wants to do is suspend a case, but we've turned over every stone, we've submitted every piece of evidence that we have, and now it's kind of a sit and wait and hope and pray.
It really became very frustrating and disappointing. What is taking so long?
"19 long years go by before the advent of familial DNA brings new hope in identifying the killers.
On their anniversaries, cold cases are reviewed to see if there are any solvability factors where it could be reassigned to the cold case unit. Fast forward, now you have all these private DNA companies that have these huge databases where you can submit your DNA and it'll tell you, where you came from and what your genealogy is. That has been a huge, huge resource and tool.
In 2018, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement received a grant where they could start sending DNA samples off to private labs. Ultimately, in 2020, they had the DNA evidence resubmitted from the crime scene of 1999, sent to a private lab.
When the blood samples were tested in the lab, it produced a list of individuals that it could have matched to.
These are potential candidates. It's not, this is definitely the person that did it, but here is a list of individuals that this DNA would potentially be connected to. So they have the DNA profiles they were excluding, and now they come to William Baer, or Billy Baer.
They figured out, oh my gosh, this man used to be a Jacksonville police detective.
In 2020, more than 20 years after the murder of Saad Kawaf, Jacksonville police have traced DNA found at the crime scene to an unlikely suspect.
Billy Baer, he had been with the sheriff's office for a very long time. He came in, I believe, in 1975.
Baer retired in 2002. He had a personnel record that was full of commendations. One of those recommendations was he saved the life of a child.
After they made the positive match on Billy Baer, they began to try to figure out who was the female assailant. And so the obvious thing was to figure out who was Baer associated with back in 1999. They did checks, found out that he was married to Melissa Schafer at that time.
If you look at the original police report, you'll see the description is of a thin, blonde-haired woman. So easy enough to run through databases, driver's license, that Melissa Jo Schafer is a blonde-haired, thin woman.
Melissa was born and raised in Cedar Rapids. She had been very athletic and played a lot of sports while she was there. She had received a softball scholarship and then had to drop out of college because she got pregnant with her first daughter. She had 2 daughters, both with the same guy, and they got married.
Unfortunately, Melissa's first marriage ended in divorce.
With Melissa, she could flip from very good and very stable to pretty mean and nasty really fast. Just say mean, terrible things.
In 1995, Melissa moved with her 2 young daughters to Jacksonville, where she met Billy Baer.
She was out at the beach over a long weekend, and Billy Baer introduced himself as a police officer, and they started seeing each other. They both liked sports. He would come over and watch football games at the house, and eventually developed a romantic relationship.
Within the year, Billy and Melissa were married.
Baer helped put her on her feet, and everything was great. She definitely appreciated his authority and the security she felt by dating a cop.
Billy remained a respected officer with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, which led to an opportunity in 1999.
The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Intelligence Division, where Detective William Baer worked, was working on a task force with Florida Department of Law Enforcement and FBI and they were looking into possible money laundering that was occurring at Saeed Kawaf's store.
William Baer was responsible for following Mr. Kawaf, placing him under surveillance to see if he could tie in anything illegal that Mr. Kawaf was doing. He knew his whereabouts. He knew when he rose. He knew when he would go to sleep. He knew that he carried large sums of cash home to prepare for deposit. There's the connection. There's your opportunity.
Five months after the murder, the homicide detectives hold an update meeting with that task force of FBI, FDLE, and JSO intelligence, and Billy Baer was part of that. He sat in that update meeting with homicide detectives.
The fact that he was involved in the initial investigation with FDLE and the FBI, it was determined that they needed to get confirmation DNA to, without a doubt, determine that he was in fact the DNA profile that was on the victim's collar.
They had to make sure that this was the right guy, and at that point, you got to get some fresh DNA to match.
So they did what's called a trash pull.
The trash pull is exactly what it sounds. Once you place your trash on the curb, it now is abandoned property. And they will obtain that trash and attempt to get DNA off any material in that bag.
Inside the trash, authorities are able to obtain Billy Baer's DNA from empty bottles and cans.
Suddenly, the match is irrevocably made. You can't dispute the DNA from 1999. They match. It's him.
On July 1st, 2020, Billy Baer is picked up and brought to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office for questioning.
I'm Detective Radigan. Your name's come up in an investigation of mine. I'd like to ask you a few questions about it.
Skip all the formalities, because I don't know what's going on. You need to tell me what's going on. I know what my rights are, so...
I'm just going to cut right to the chase. You know this gentleman right here?
Sure, son.
Never saw him before?
Lisa, I don't remember anybody.
Well, this is Mr. Kawaf, who was murdered back in May 17th, 1999.
Okay.
You were on the money laundering task force at the time, who Mr. Kawaf was being investigated on.
I don't remember.
He was in Deerwood.
I don't remember
No, don't remember?
any of that. Obviously, you're accusing me of something. You got me under arrest.
I am.
I think I need a lawyer.
I think that's pretty obvious.
Coming up, details about Saad Kawaf's murder are finally revealed to law enforcement.
She had been holding this inside her for years, and it was finally a relief to get this off her chest.
The best I can ever tell them is I'm sorry. "21 years after the murder of Saad Kawaf, Jacksonville authorities have taken retired police officer Billy Baer into custody for the crime. Based on Summer Kawaf's description, investigators believe Billy's ex-wife Melissa Schafer is likely his female accomplice.
Detectives find out that Melissa Jo Schafer is no longer married and is now living in Missouri.
So cold case detectives coordinated with the Jefferson City Police. A traffic stop was conducted and she was brought to the police station where she was interviewed.
So kind of going down memory lane a little bit, anything jarring you why we would be talking to you from Jacksonville? So
I know exactly what you're talking about.
She immediately knew why they were there and stated that she had been holding this inside her for years and couldn't tell anybody, and that it was finally a relief to get this off her chest.
tell me how all this transpired and we got to that day in May of 1999.
He needed money.
She said Billy Baer at some point had been shot in the line of duty. And during his surgery for that, they discovered he had cancer. And apparently that set him back significantly financially.
Whatever he was doing in the intelligence division, they had been running, I don't know if this guy ran a convenience store or a gas station or what he did. It was something like that.
Yeah.
And it had everything to do with how many deposits this guy was making, and he was always making them under what would get caught by the government.
Yeah.
But he had it in his head that they've got to have all this extra money in their house. If we went there, that he would be able to get the money and everything would be okay.
She said he basically lied about Mr. Kawaf, said Mr. Kawaf was involved in drugs, that if they robbed Mr. Kawaf of the money, Mr. Kawaf never would report the crime. Baer had convinced her that this would be okay. We're just robbing somebody who's a criminal.
Melissa tells investigators that on the morning of May 17, 1999, the couple drove to Saad Kawaf's home.
Baer knew that they would be able to enter the gated community if they said they were realtors. He had gone as far to have business cards made indicating that they were realtors. They drove their red Jeep Cherokee from their house that morning, entered Deerwood, went directly to the victim's house.
They both got out of the car, approached the garage, and Mr. Kawaf was coming out of the garage.
Well, I think the gentleman knew that something was wrong.
Okay.
That something wasn't right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, all I know is that they started fighting. And the next thing I know, his wife came out from the house into the garage. And I started wrestling around with her.
She claims the wife immediately started defending herself and actually bit her.
Did she bite you?
It used to be a half a moon.
That's not the scar from it?
It's
Like
just the scar.
Remember asking her for money?
Yes. So that's what he told me to do. I go in, and of course that lady is scared to death, which I would be too. Said she didn't know what I was talking about.
William Baer comes in with a knife, puts it to her throat, threatens to kill her.
He started yelling at her and said, "You know what we're talking about?" She went over into the cabinet in the kitchen and pulled out a whole bunch of money and gave it to her.
Baer went over and rinsed his blood off of his arms. They then duct taped Mrs. Kawaf to a chair in the kitchen and left out the way they came in, back through the garage.
So what happens after that?
Minus me just crying all the way home, I was told where to put the money in our house. He showered and went to work.
At that point, their relationship was seriously changed. She was just petrified and dumbfounded by what happened and how foolish she had been to be involved in this. They eventually bought a home, but basically it was like two families living in the same home. Their marriage was shot.
She stated she eventually worked up the courage to get divorced and then left Jacksonville and moved back up to Missouri to assist with her family.
Legally, she's responsible and equally responsible for the crime. She's a co-defendant, participated in a robbery. The robbery went bad and someone was killed.
There was really just no excuse that she could provide as to why she went along with this, and then kept quiet for all these years.
I can't give that woman her husband back. I can't give that daughter her dad back. The best I can ever tell them is I'm sorry. And I don't expect your forgiveness.
Following her confession, Melissa Schafer is extradited to Florida.
Baer was indicted for first-degree murder, which in Florida at the time of the offense would have allowed for the death penalty. Schafer was charged with second-degree murder, which has a more flexible sentencing range.
This was a pre-planned, premeditated robbery because you had the facts as an intelligence detective that this person had money from his business and you were going to take it.
With such kind of horrible situation, is not a matter of voice, it's a matter of conscience. So these were both conscienceless people.
After 21 years, Billy Baer and his ex-wife, Melissa Jo Schafer, have been charged in the 1999 murder of 39-year-old business owner Saad Kawaf. Rather than face a life sentence, Melissa agrees to testify against her ex-husband.
Since Baer had not confessed, Mrs. Schafer's testimony would be helpful in the prosecution of Baer, and she was willing to do it.
On December 18, 2020, Melissa pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
She cooperated fully. She sat down with our state attorney and gave a full explanation of what had occurred. She provided a deposition testimony to Baer's lawyer. I think that Mrs. Schafer's testimony pushed Baer to realize that this was a hopeless case for him, so he eventually worked out a plea agreement.
In 2021, Billy Baer pleads guilty to avoid the death penalty and is sentenced to life without parole, while Melissa Schafer is sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Her attorney wanted 25, the judge gave her 30. I think it's appropriate. It shows complicity. It shows a willingness in the moment to be part of this scheme to rob, and then this willingness to hide the homicide.
Anybody that knows her, they can't believe that this young gal who is honest, intelligent, a leader, good person, could have ever been brought into something this horrible. I think that she was just particularly susceptible to a pressure that Baer put on her to be involved in this.
I think it's pretty clear she had every opportunity not to do it. Do I think he pressured her? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, it was her choice either to go or not go. And she chose to go.
Melissa Schafer's never been anybody's victim. She's very aggressive in the same way that she could flip that switch and be this angry person. She can flip it right back the other way and come across as soft-spoken, caring. If she went over there that day with Baer and they murdered this man, she went willingly. She went because of what was in it for her. She was an angry, selfish person.
I am glad that justice has been served, even though it will not bring that father or that brother or that kind human being back, but at least right now, the closure is that we know what happened.
To realize that William Baer, after the murder, was sitting with his task force of federal and state agents, listening to an update on the homicide that he committed being discussed, that is just amazing to me.
The fact that he's retired law enforcement leaves a bad taste in your mouth. It's beyond disappointing when you learn that one of your own is capable of doing something like this. He needed her help, and she didn't want to disappoint. So for this particular event, I would say they would have been a perfect match.
It's sad for the Kawaf family that this happened to him. Mr. Kawaf came to America for a better life for himself as well as his family. He moved into an affluent neighborhood, a gated community where he felt safe, and they just wanted to live a peaceful life, being successful, and that dream fell short.
Saad was a family man, he was a generous man, he was very pious, righteous, smiling, very social, very friendly, very caring, a person who was kind to everybody. When these kind of souls go away, they leave a huge vacuum. I believe if he would have been given the opportunity to live, he would have made a huge difference in the lives of so many people around him.
The badge on the uniform caught the afternoon sun long before anyone imagined it would become part of a scandal that reached far beyond the streets of a quiet California city. In Torrance, just south of downtown Los Angeles, police cruisers rolled through neighborhoods lined with palm trees and carefully trimmed lawns. Families walked their dogs beneath cloudless skies. Children rode bicycles through suburban streets that seemed untouched by the chaos often associated with larger cities. To many residents, the Torrance Police Department represented order, professionalism, and stability. Officers were expected to answer emergency calls, settle neighborhood disputes, and stand between ordinary people and the uncertainty of violence. The image was reassuring. It was also incomplete. Every institution survives on something less visible than uniforms or official policies. It survives on trust. Trust is difficult to measure because it cannot be photographed or locked inside an evidence room. It exists quietly, growing through thousands of ordinary encounters between strangers. A driver stopped for speeding believes the officer will treat him fairly. A frightened witness believes her statement will be heard without prejudice. A grieving family believes investigators will pursue the truth regardless of race, wealth, or influence. Justice depends upon that invisible promise. But what happens when that promise begins to crack from within? The first sign did not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic headlines. There was no dramatic confession broadcast live on television. There was no anonymous whistleblower carrying a secret folder into a newsroom. Instead, the story began the way many of history's largest scandals begin, with something that appeared surprisingly ordinary. A criminal investigation. A damaged vehicle. 2 police officers. At first glance, it looked like a case that might occupy investigators for only a short time before disappearing into filing cabinets already crowded with paperwork. Few outside law enforcement paid much attention. Even those inside the department could not have predicted that a routine examination of digital evidence would soon expose something far larger than the original allegations. Modern investigations rarely begin and end at the crime scene. Phones have become diaries, calendars, cameras, and private conversation rooms carried inside every pocket. Investigators know that a single device can reveal movements, relationships, photographs, and messages stretching back years. Every notification, every deleted conversation, every forgotten image has the potential to become evidence. Sometimes the smallest digital doorway opens into an entirely different world. As forensic specialists examined seized phones connected to the investigation, they were not searching for a scandal that could shake an entire police department. They were looking for evidence relevant to the allegations before them. The process was methodical, technical, almost routine. Files were recovered. Messages were organized. Conversations were reconstructed. Then the investigation took a turn no one had expected. The messages did not stop. One conversation led to another. One group chat connected to another. Names repeated themselves. The list grew longer. Instead of isolated exchanges between 2 individuals, investigators discovered extensive conversations involving numerous officers communicating across private messaging platforms. The content reached far beyond casual workplace humor or harmless banter. What emerged painted a deeply troubling picture that would eventually become the subject of court proceedings, media investigations, and official reviews. Behind the polished image of professional policing, investigators encountered messages containing racist language directed at Black people, derogatory remarks targeting Asian communities, insults aimed at Jewish people, and contemptuous comments about immigrants. Other exchanges mocked members of the LGBTQ+ community through offensive language and images. Even more disturbing were conversations in which violence was joked about or casually discussed in ways that raised profound questions about judgment, professionalism, and impartiality. The discovery transformed the investigation almost overnight. Questions multiplied faster than answers. How long had these conversations existed? How many officers had participated? Did private conversations reflect private prejudice, or did they reveal something that could influence public policing? Could people arrested by officers involved in those conversations believe they had received fair treatment? Could juries continue accepting testimony from officers whose private communications now faced intense public scrutiny? Those questions would eventually spread far beyond Torrance. Long before courtrooms debated legal consequences, before civil lawsuits accumulated, before state officials announced sweeping reforms, there was only disbelief. For many residents, the revelations collided violently with the department's public image. Torrance was not widely known across America for explosive scandals or widespread disorder. Its reputation rested upon relative stability compared with many surrounding communities. That contrast made the allegations especially difficult to process. Scandals involving police departments often focus on a single encounter captured on body cameras or cell phone videos. A controversial arrest. A fatal shooting. A disputed use of force. Public attention centers on one moment frozen in time. The Torrance controversy was different. Its center was not one confrontation on one street during one afternoon. Its center was conversation. Words exchanged behind closed digital doors. Words never intended for public eyes. Words written with the confidence that they would remain permanently hidden. Technology preserved what memory never could. Every message carried a timestamp. Every reply established context. Every forwarded image became part of a growing digital record. Unlike spoken conversations that disappear into silence, electronic communication leaves footprints. Those footprints would eventually become impossible to ignore. As reporters began examining court documents and public records, the story grew larger with every publication. Each revelation generated another wave of concern. Prosecutors found themselves confronting uncomfortable realities. Defense attorneys recognized opportunities to challenge criminal cases involving officers connected to the messages. Community activists demanded accountability. Families whose loved ones had experienced encounters with the department wondered whether hidden prejudice had influenced decisions that changed lives forever. The scandal reached beyond legal procedure. It challenged perception itself. People naturally separate public identity from private behavior. Society assumes professionals maintain standards even when cameras are absent. Teachers, judges, doctors, firefighters, and police officers occupy positions requiring public confidence. Their authority depends not only upon technical skill but also upon character. When private communications appear fundamentally inconsistent with public responsibility, confidence erodes quickly. That erosion does not happen through dramatic explosions. It happens quietly. One newspaper article. One court filing. One newly released document. One difficult question asked during a community meeting. Trust rarely collapses all at once. It disappears piece by piece. The controversy became even more significant because it intersected with earlier public concerns surrounding policing and community relations. Previous incidents involving use of force had already generated scrutiny, including the fatal police shooting of Christopher DeAndre Mitchell in 2018. During later legal proceedings connected to the messaging scandal, Some communications referencing Mitchell's family after public demonstrations became part of broader concerns regarding professionalism and impartiality. Those revelations deepened public outrage and intensified demands for independent oversight. By then, this was no longer merely an internal personnel issue. It had become a question about institutional culture. Could offensive messages exchanged across multiple offices represent isolated failures? Or did they reflect broader problems within the organization itself? The distinction mattered enormously. If only a few individuals behaved inappropriately, disciplinary action might resolve the problem. If the culture itself permitted such behavior to flourish unchecked, then reform would require something much larger than suspensions or resignations. It would require rebuilding confidence from the ground up. Across California, legal observers watched carefully. Civil rights advocates watched carefully. Prosecutors watched carefully. Defense attorneys watched even more carefully. Because every criminal conviction involving officers connected to the scandal carried a new layer of uncertainty. Every testimony invited renewed examination. Every investigation faced additional scrutiny. Cases once considered closed suddenly appeared vulnerable to fresh legal challenges. The consequences extended well beyond reputational damage. They reached courtrooms, evidence, appeals, and the very foundation upon which criminal prosecutions depend. Years after the first phones were examined, the controversy would eventually lead to a sweeping investigation by the California Attorney General's office and an enforceable agreement requiring extensive reforms within the Torrance Police Department. Independent oversight, policy changes, enhanced accountability measures, and mandatory improvements to training reflected the state's conclusion that restoring public confidence required more than promises. But none of that had happened yet. At the beginning of this story, there were only investigators scrolling through messages that seemed to multiply without end, each new discovery raising another unsettling question. How many more conversations remained unseen? How many decisions had been influenced by attitudes hidden behind closed screens? And perhaps the most troubling question of all was one no database could answer. If those phones had never been examined, would anyone outside that small circle have ever known what was being said behind the badge? Southern California has always possessed a peculiar talent for creating illusions. From a distance, everything appears almost cinematic. Endless sunshine spills across wide boulevards lined with towering palm trees. The Pacific Ocean glitters only a few miles away, carrying cool evening breezes into neighborhoods where freshly cut lawns stretch toward quiet streets. Shopping centers bustle with families on weekends. Coffee shops fill with students and professionals discussing ordinary plans for ordinary lives. Police cruisers glide through intersections so frequently that they almost disappear into the scenery, becoming just another familiar part of daily life. Torrance, California, is often described as one of the safest cities in Los Angeles County. For decades, the city cultivated an image of stability. Unlike many neighboring communities that frequently appeared in headlines because of gang violence or soaring crime rates, Torrance projected something different. It was known for good schools, established neighborhoods, thriving businesses, and a population that expected public institutions to function with professionalism. People moved there because they believed it offered predictability. Parents believed their children could ride bicycles through residential streets without constant fear. Small business owners believed police officers would respond quickly whenever trouble appeared. Residents believed emergency calls would be answered by professionals committed to protecting everyone equally. That belief was never written into law. It existed as something far more powerful. Expectation. Every morning, before most residents poured their first cup of coffee, patrol officers reported for duty inside the Torrance Police Department headquarters. Uniforms were inspected. Radios were tested. Patrol assignments were reviewed. Shift supervisors briefed officers about overnight incidents, traffic concerns, wanted suspects, and community events scheduled throughout the day. To an outside observer, everything appeared remarkably routine. Routine is comforting. Routine creates confidence. Routine convinces both officers and civilians that the system is functioning exactly as intended. But institutions rarely reveal their deepest truths during formal briefings. They reveal themselves in hallways after meetings have ended. Inside patrol cars during long overnight shifts. Around break room tables where supervisors are absent. Inside text messages exchanged after midnight. The public rarely sees those moments. They are the invisible spaces where workplace culture quietly grows. Every police department develops its own personality over time. Some become known for strict professionalism. Others become famous for community engagement. Some struggle with poor leadership. Others thrive because experienced officers mentor younger recruits with patience and integrity. Culture is never created by official mission statements hanging on lobby walls. It develops through countless interactions between colleagues. New officers quickly learn unwritten rules. Who receives respect? Who receives ridicule? Which behavior earns praise? Which mistakes are quietly ignored? Which jokes make everyone laugh? Which comments make everyone uncomfortable? Sometimes those unwritten rules shape an organization more powerfully than official policy ever can. For years, Torrance Police Department maintained a public reputation built upon efficiency and discipline. The department served a diverse community reflecting much of Southern California itself. Residents came from countless cultural backgrounds. Black families, Asian American communities, Latino neighborhoods, white professionals, immigrants who had arrived decades earlier, and newcomers searching for opportunity all shared the same city. That diversity demanded something essential from law enforcement. Impartiality. Every traffic stop. Every arrest. Every domestic violence investigation. Every witness interview. Every courtroom testimony. Each required the public to believe that race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or social status would never determine how justice was delivered. Without that belief, policing becomes infinitely more difficult. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be earned repeatedly. Yet beneath the calm surface, criticism occasionally surfaced. Community members questioned certain uses of force. Civil rights advocates raised concerns about transparency. Attorneys representing criminal defendants sometimes challenged police conduct during court proceedings. Most of those concerns never became national news. Instead, they accumulated quietly. Individual complaints. Individual lawsuits. Individual stories. Viewed separately, each incident appeared manageable. Viewed together, they formed a pattern that some observers believed deserved greater attention. The department consistently maintained that allegations were investigated through established procedures. Internal review systems existed for precisely that purpose. Supervisors evaluated complaints. Administrative processes determined whether officers had violated departmental policies. From the outside, accountability appeared to exist. Whether that accountability always satisfied critics was another matter entirely. Across the United States, policing had already entered an era of extraordinary public scrutiny. Body cameras had changed expectations. Cell phone videos had changed expectations. Social media had changed expectations. Incidents that once remained local could now become international news within hours. Every controversial encounter carried the possibility of being recorded from multiple angles. Every official statement faced immediate public examination. Communities increasingly demanded transparency. Departments increasingly found themselves balancing public confidence with internal discipline. Torrance was not isolated from those national conversations. Like departments everywhere, it operated within an environment where every decision carried greater visibility than ever before. Still, many officers continued performing difficult work with professionalism every single day. Most emergency calls involved frightened people needing immediate help rather than dramatic confrontations. Missing children, traffic collisions, mental health crises, domestic disputes, medical emergencies. The public usually encountered officers during the worst moments of their lives. That reality placed enormous responsibility upon every badge. Because one interaction can shape someone's perception of law enforcement forever. A respectful conversation can build trust lasting years. An abusive encounter can destroy it in seconds. Inside the department, however, another world existed beyond public observation. Officers spent long hours together. Patrol shifts often lasted 12 hours. Partners relied upon one another for personal safety. Danger created powerful bonds. Shared experiences created friendships. Those friendships extended beyond working hours. They met for meals. They celebrated promotions. They attended family gatherings. They exchanged photographs. They shared jokes. Like countless professions, modern policing increasingly relied upon digital communication. Text messaging replaced many casual conversations. Group chats became virtual break rooms. Information traveled instantly between colleagues. Schedules. Shift changes. Funny photographs. Holiday greetings. Sports discussions. Everything mixed together inside smartphones carried everywhere officers went. Technology erased traditional boundaries between professional and personal communication. A message written in seconds could remain preserved for years. Most people rarely consider that possibility while typing. Messages feel temporary, disposable, private. Yet digital communication possesses remarkable permanence. Deleted conversations sometimes remain recoverable. Backups preserve forgotten exchanges. Cloud storage quietly remembers what individuals themselves forget. Years later, investigators may reconstruct conversations with astonishing precision. Those realities would eventually become central to one of California's most consequential police scandals. But in the years before public disclosure, none of that seemed obvious. Life continued. Promotions occurred. New recruits graduated from the police academy. Veteran officers approached retirement. Residents attended city festivals. Children played baseball beneath bright California evenings. Businesses opened. Businesses closed. The city moved forward exactly as cities always do. No visible warning announced what investigators would eventually uncover. No newspaper predicted that hundreds of private messages would fundamentally reshape public confidence. The department's official image remained largely intact. Professional photographs showed smiling officers participating in community outreach events. Police vehicles appeared at school safety programs. Neighborhood meetings emphasized cooperation between officers and residents. Everything projected reassurance. Images matter. Public relations matter. But neither necessarily reveals institutional reality. Culture cannot be measured through photographs. It cannot be fully understood through press releases. Sometimes it reveals itself only when privacy disappears. That moment arrived unexpectedly in January 2020. The catalyst was surprisingly narrow. 2 officers. A vandalized vehicle. Allegations involving the drawing of a swastika. Investigators initially pursued evidence related only to those accusations. Nothing suggested they were standing at the entrance to something vastly larger. When digital forensic specialists began examining the officers' phones, they were following ordinary investigative procedure. Electronic evidence had become routine. Phones routinely contained location data, call histories, photographs, messages. Investigators searched methodically, patiently, professionally. Then the pattern began to emerge. One conversation referenced another. Another included additional participants. Names repeated across multiple message threads. The volume itself became impossible to ignore. What initially appeared to be isolated exchanges slowly revealed an interconnected network of conversations extending across numerous offices. The content changed everything. Messages included racist language directed toward Black people. Others mocked Asian communities. Some insulted Jewish individuals. Others targeted immigrants. Additional conversations contained homophobic slurs and degrading references to LGBTQ+ people. Most disturbing of all were messages that appeared to joke about violence, celebrate aggressive policing, or reference extreme acts in ways investigators and later prosecutors found deeply troubling. The discovery fundamentally altered the investigation. No longer was the focus limited to allegations involving vandalism. Now investigators faced an entirely different question. Did these private communications reveal merely offensive personal opinions? Or did they expose something capable of influencing official police conduct? The answer carried enormous legal consequences. If officers entrusted with enforcing laws privately expressed prejudice toward particular communities, defense attorneys could argue that such attitudes might affect arrests, investigations, witness credibility, or courtroom testimony. That possibility reached beyond ethics. It reached into constitutional questions concerning fairness and due process. Inside prosecutor offices across Los Angeles County, concern quietly spread. Cases involving officers connected to the messages required careful review. Defense lawyers demanded disclosure. Judges examined new legal arguments. The ripple effects expanded far beyond Torrance city limits. What had begun with a damaged automobile was becoming a statewide issue. The setting for this story was never merely a police station. It was an entire system built upon public confidence. And now, that confidence faced its greatest test. Because once hidden words become public evidence, they stop belonging only to the people who wrote them. They become part of history. And history has a way of asking questions that institutions cannot easily answer. For years, the people of Torrance lived with a quiet understanding that the police department was one of the constants in their lives. A patrol car parked outside a school was a reassuring sight. An officer directing traffic after a collision represented order returning to chaos. The familiar blue and white cruisers moving through residential neighborhoods blended into the rhythm of everyday life so completely that most residents hardly noticed them anymore. That kind of familiarity creates something powerful. It creates confidence. Not every interaction between the public and law enforcement is memorable. Most are routine. A traffic stop ends with a warning. A missing wallet is returned to its owner. An officer helps an elderly resident after a fall. A frightened parent calls 911 because a child has wandered away for a few terrifying minutes. These ordinary moments rarely make headlines, yet they become the foundation upon which public trust is built. For many residents, Torrance represented stability in a region often associated with congestion, crime, and unpredictability. Families settled there believing it was a place where children could grow up safely. Small business owners invested their savings believing the city offered security. Immigrant families worked long hours to build new lives, trusting that public institutions would protect them as they protected everyone else. Justice, after all, is supposed to be blind. It is not supposed to recognize skin color before it recognizes the law. It is not supposed to distinguish between accents, religions, or neighborhoods. It is not supposed to favor one citizen while viewing another with suspicion before a single word has been spoken. Those principles are easy to print inside official policy manuals. Living by them every day is far more difficult. Long before the scandal became public, questions about policing were already being discussed throughout the United States. Communities across the country were debating accountability, transparency, use of force, and the relationship between police departments and the people they served. Every new incident in one city echoed through countless others. Residents watched national news with growing awareness that confidence in law enforcement could no longer be taken for granted. Torrance was not isolated from those conversations. Although many officers carried out their duties professionally, criticism had surfaced over the years concerning certain encounters between police and members of the public. Individual complaints, civil lawsuits, and allegations involving the use of force periodically drew attention to broader concerns about oversight and accountability. None of those issues alone defined the department, but together they formed part of the backdrop against which later revelations would be viewed. Among the incidents that remained in public memory was the 2018 fatal police shooting of Christopher DeAndre Mitchell. The shooting prompted grief, anger, and public demonstrations. Mitchell's family sought answers. Supporters gathered outside the police department. Community members called for transparency regarding the circumstances surrounding the shooting. For the Mitchell family, those demonstrations were not political theater. They were expressions of loss. When a loved one dies during an encounter with law enforcement, the search for answers rarely ends when the investigation concludes. Families continue living with questions that no official report can fully erase. As later court filings connected to the text message investigation became public, some communications involving references to Mitchell's family after those demonstrations added another layer to the controversy. Those disclosures intensified criticism because they appeared inconsistent with the professionalism expected of public servants entrusted with extraordinary authority. For many residents, those revelations were deeply unsettling. Not because offensive language alone defines an institution, but because people naturally ask whether private attitudes can influence public decisions. That question became impossible to ignore. Imagine being stopped by an officer for a traffic violation. Imagine sitting inside your vehicle, wondering whether you are being judged solely by your actions, or by assumptions you cannot see. Imagine testifying as a witness, hoping your words will be weighed fairly. Imagine reporting a crime and believing the officer listening to your story sees you first as a person, not as a stereotype. Most people never consciously ask themselves those questions. They assume fairness. They assume professionalism. That assumption is essential. Without it, every interaction becomes uncertain. The publication of the messages challenged that assumption. For members of communities mentioned in the conversations, the impact extended far beyond the words themselves. Black residents questioned whether racial stereotypes might have influenced encounters they had experienced. Asian American families wondered whether officers who publicly presented themselves as professionals privately held contempt toward people who looked like them. Jewish residents read reports describing offensive remarks directed at their faith. Immigrant communities considered whether language and cultural differences had affected previous interactions. Members of the LGBTQ+ community confronted reports that some private conversations included derogatory language directed toward people like them. The emotional impact could not be measured through statistics. Trust rarely leaves fingerprints. Its absence cannot be photographed. Yet communities recognize immediately when it begins to disappear. Some residents expressed disappointment. Others felt anger. Still others said the revelations confirmed concerns they had carried for years. Not every reaction was identical. Some defended the department while acknowledging that inappropriate private communications required accountability. Others argued that the actions of a number of officers should not define every employee wearing the uniform. Many officers who had never participated in the messages suddenly found themselves working beneath the shadow of a scandal they did not create. That reality highlighted another consequence often overlooked in public controversy. Institutional failures affect innocent colleagues as well. A police department functions as a team. When confidence in the institution declines, even officers who consistently perform their duties with integrity may encounter greater skepticism from the public. Every traffic stop becomes more complicated. Every courtroom testimony receives greater scrutiny. Every community meeting begins with additional barriers to overcome. Trust, once damaged, is difficult for anyone inside the institution to rebuild. Meanwhile, prosecutors faced a different challenge. Their responsibility extends beyond obtaining convictions. They are also obligated to ensure that criminal proceedings remain fair. As information about the messages emerged, prosecutors reviewed cases involving officers connected to the communications. Questions arose concerning disclosure obligations, witness credibility, and whether defense attorneys should receive information that might bear upon an officer's reliability as a witness. For defendants whose cases involved those officers, the controversy created new legal arguments. Defense lawyers examined whether private communications revealing prejudice or inappropriate comments could affect assessments of credibility in court. Judges were asked to consider issues reaching beyond individual guilt or innocence. The controversy had become part of the legal process itself. That development demonstrated how institutional trust influences every stage of the justice system. Police investigate. Prosecutors evaluate evidence. Defense attorneys challenge it. Judges oversee proceedings. Jurors weigh credibility. If confidence in one part of that chain weakens, pressure spreads throughout the entire system. The consequences reached beyond criminal courtrooms. Civil litigation expanded as individuals alleged violations of constitutional rights and discriminatory treatment. Each lawsuit carried its own facts and legal questions, but together they reflected a broader concern that public confidence had been shaken. Financial costs followed. So did reputational costs. Neither could be repaired quickly. City officials faced growing pressure to respond. Residents attended meetings seeking explanations. Community organizations advocated for greater transparency. Journalists continued reviewing public records and court documents. Each new disclosure prompted additional questions rather than definitive answers. What safeguards had existed? Were warning signs overlooked? Could earlier intervention have prevented the situation from reaching this point? Those questions echoed through city government, legal offices, and neighborhoods alike. The controversy also underscored a larger truth about modern policing. Authority depends not only upon legal power but upon legitimacy. People comply with the law more willingly when they believe those enforcing it act fairly. When confidence weakens, cooperation often becomes more difficult. Witnesses hesitate. Victims become reluctant to report crimes. Community relationships suffer. Rebuilding those relationships requires sustained effort extending far beyond disciplinary action. For many residents, the most painful realization was not simply that offensive messages existed. It was that the conversations appeared to have continued over time without coming to light until investigators examining an unrelated matter discovered them. That sequence of events prompted another difficult question. If the phones had never been searched, would the messages have remained hidden indefinitely? No one could answer with certainty. Yet the question itself reflected the depth of public concern. As months turned into years, the scandal became about more than individual conduct. It became a case study in institutional culture, oversight, and accountability. The people of Torrance were no longer observing a controversy unfolding somewhere else. They were living through it. Parents discussing local news over dinner. Business owners talking with customers. Neighbors debating headlines across backyard fences. Former jurors wondering about cases they had once followed. Young people considering careers in public service. Everyone encountered the same unsettling reality from a different perspective. Because when trust is questioned inside an institution responsible for enforcing the law, the impact extends far beyond the walls of a police station. It reaches every courtroom, every neighborhood, every family that has ever dialed 911 expecting help, and every citizen who believes that justice must be administered without fear, favoritism, or prejudice. By the time state officials began examining the department more closely, the story had already grown beyond a local controversy. It had become a broader examination of what happens when private conduct collides with public responsibility. The investigation that followed would seek not only to determine what had happened, but also whether the system itself needed to change to restore the confidence that had been so profoundly tested. Every investigation begins with a question. Sometimes that question is simple. Who broke into the house? Who fired the weapon? Who left the fingerprints behind? Other times, investigators do not yet realize they are asking the wrong question altogether. In January 2020, attention within the Torrance Police Department centered on allegations involving two officers, Cody Weldon and Christopher Tomsick. According to later court records and reporting, the officers were investigated in connection with accusations that a swastika had been drawn on the vehicle of a man following his arrest and that the vehicle had been vandalized. At that stage, the inquiry focused on those allegations. No one publicly understood that the investigation would soon expand far beyond the reported acts of vandalism. The assignment appeared straightforward. Gather physical evidence. Interview witnesses. Review available records. Examine electronic devices that might contain information relevant to the allegations. By 2020, digital evidence had become a routine component of criminal investigations. A modern smartphone is more than a communication device. It stores photographs, location histories, internet searches, contact lists, calendars, and years of conversations. Messages sent casually in seconds can remain preserved long after the sender has forgotten they were written. For investigators, electronic devices often provide timelines that human memory cannot. Digital forensic specialists approached the examination using established procedures designed to preserve evidence. Devices are copied before analysis so that investigators work from forensic images rather than altering the original data. Specialized software reconstructs deleted material where possible, organizes conversations chronologically, and links participants across message threads. The process is technical rather than dramatic. Hours pass while software indexes files. Investigators compare timestamps. Conversations are placed into context. Most examinations uncover information directly related to the original investigation. This one did not. As messages were reviewed, investigators reportedly encountered conversations that extended well beyond the allegations surrounding the damaged vehicle. Additional message threads appeared. Multiple participants were involved. The communications covered extended periods rather than isolated exchanges connected to a single incident. The scope immediately changed. Instead of reviewing evidence concerning one alleged act of misconduct, investigators were looking at communications that raised broader questions about professional conduct within the department. The discovery did not become public overnight. Evidence collected during criminal investigations must be evaluated carefully. Investigators distinguish between information relevant to criminal allegations, potential administrative misconduct, and material that may have legal significance in future proceedings. As the review continued, concerns grew. Court records and later reporting described messages containing racist language directed toward Black people, derogatory remarks about Asian communities, offensive references to Jewish individuals, and disparaging comments regarding immigrants. Other communications included homophobic slurs and offensive material targeting members of the LGBTQ+ community. Those messages alone raised significant concerns regarding professionalism and departmental culture. But investigators reportedly found additional conversations that generated even greater scrutiny. Some messages referenced violence in ways that later became central to public criticism. According to reporting based on court documents, certain exchanges included remarks joking about hanging suspects, shooting people, beating individuals in custody, or otherwise treating violence as a subject for humor rather than the serious responsibility that accompanies law enforcement authority. Those communications would later become among the most widely discussed aspects of the scandal. It is important to distinguish between private messages and documented official conduct. The investigation did not conclude that every statement reflected an action taken in the field. However, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and courts recognized that such communications could bear upon questions of credibility, impartiality, and professional judgment. That distinction became legally significant. Police officers occupy a unique position within the justice system. They investigate crimes. They prepare reports. They testify under oath. Their observations often influence charging decisions and jury verdicts. Because of that role, information that could affect an officer's credibility may become relevant in criminal proceedings. As additional material was reviewed, investigators recognized that the implications extended beyond internal discipline. If officers involved in criminal cases had participated in communications reflecting bias or inappropriate attitudes, prosecutors might have disclosure obligations in cases where those officers served as witnesses. Defense attorneys could argue that such information was relevant when evaluating credibility before juries. What began as one investigation now intersected with hundreds of others. The ripple effect had begun. Within law enforcement agencies, internal investigations often proceed quietly while evidence is evaluated. Personnel matters involve legal protections, administrative procedures, and evidentiary requirements. As a result, the public rarely learns immediately when internal reviews begin. That was true here as well. Behind closed doors, investigators examined message histories. Supervisors assessed potential policy violations. Legal advisors considered the implications for pending criminal prosecutions. Prosecutors reviewed cases involving officers connected to the communications. The work was painstaking. Every participant identified in a message thread had to be placed within the appropriate factual context. Every communication required careful evaluation. The questions multiplied. How many officers had participated? How many conversations existed? Over what period had the messages been exchanged? Did participation differ from endorsement? Were some individuals active contributors while others simply remained members of group conversations? These distinctions mattered. Administrative investigations seek to determine individual responsibility rather than assume collective guilt. As more information became available through court filings and media reporting, the public gradually learned that approximately 15 officers were ultimately placed under internal investigation, with more than a dozen identified as having participated in various message exchanges. Over time, several officers left the department or were placed on administrative leave while investigations and related proceedings continued. Those developments fueled public interest. Residents who had never before considered the internal culture of the department suddenly found themselves asking difficult questions. Community organizations requested greater transparency. Civil rights advocates called for accountability. Journalists sought access to court records and public documents. Legal analysts examined how the revelations might affect pending criminal cases. The story expanded beyond Torrance. Across California, prosecutors and defense attorneys watched closely because the implications reached beyond one department. If credibility concerns affected officers serving as witnesses, criminal cases could require additional review. Each prosecution involving a participating officer had to be evaluated individually. Some cases proceeded unchanged. Others required disclosure of information to defense counsel. Still others faced motions challenging witness credibility. The justice system relies heavily upon confidence in sworn testimony. Anything capable of influencing that confidence receives careful legal scrutiny. The controversy also intersected with earlier public concerns surrounding the fatal police shooting of Christopher DeAndre Mitchell in 2018. During later legal proceedings, certain messages referring to Mitchell's family after public demonstrations became part of the broader public record. Those communications intensified criticism because they appeared inconsistent with expectations of professionalism toward grieving families engaged in lawful public protest. For many observers, that connection transformed the scandal. It was no longer viewed solely as offensive private communication. It became part of a broader discussion concerning public confidence, institutional culture, and accountability. Meanwhile, city officials faced growing pressure to respond. Questions extended beyond individual officers. What supervisory systems had existed? How were complaints reviewed? Could warning signs have been detected earlier? Were existing policies sufficient to address inappropriate electronic communications among employees? Those questions had no immediate answers. Institutional change rarely occurs quickly. Investigations require evidence. Administrative proceedings require due process. Policy reform requires careful planning. Yet one reality had already become clear. The original investigation had uncovered something no one publicly expected. The phones examined in connection with one alleged incident had revealed conversations reaching far beyond that event. Without the forensic examination, those communications might never have entered the public record. Technology had preserved them. The investigation had uncovered them. The legal system would now have to determine what they meant. For the community, the incident marked the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Not because every question had been answered, but because entirely new questions had emerged. Questions about culture. Questions about oversight. Questions about whether private communications reflected isolated misconduct or deeper institutional problems. Those questions would not be resolved in a single investigation. They would shape years of litigation, independent review, public debate, and ultimately statewide intervention. The discovery inside those phones was not the conclusion of the story. It was the moment the story truly began. There is a moment in some investigations when the evidence stops answering the original question and begins asking new ones. For the investigators reviewing electronic evidence connected to the January 2020 case, that moment did not arrive with a dramatic confession or the discovery of a hidden document. It emerged gradually, message by message, conversation by conversation, as the contents of seized mobile phones were examined through standard digital forensic procedures. At first, the work followed a familiar rhythm. Electronic devices were processed. Data was preserved. Messages were reconstructed in chronological order. Investigators compared timestamps, participants, and the context surrounding individual exchanges. Nothing about the methodology was extraordinary. Modern criminal investigations routinely rely upon digital evidence because smartphones often preserve details that human memory cannot. Conversations written years earlier may remain accessible long after their authors have forgotten they exist. What proved extraordinary was not the process. It was the material that the process uncovered. As investigators moved beyond the communications directly related to the original allegations, they encountered broader message threads involving multiple members of the Torrance Police Department. The conversations extended across different periods and included a number of participants rather than only the officers whose devices had initially been examined. The scope of the inquiry changed immediately. The investigation was no longer limited to determining whether misconduct had occurred during a single incident. Instead, officials faced the possibility that the recovered communications reflected issues extending beyond individual behavior. Evidence collected during a criminal investigation is not automatically released to the public. Investigators first determine its relevance, prosecutors evaluate its legal significance, and administrative officials consider whether internal policy violations require separate review. That careful process took time. Within law enforcement and prosecutorial offices, the implications became increasingly apparent. Some of the recovered communications contained racist language directed toward black individuals. Others included derogatory comments about Asian people, Jewish people, immigrants, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. Additional messages referenced violence in ways that later drew significant public criticism, including exchanges that appeared to joke about or make light of violent acts. The existence of those communications raised immediate professional and legal concerns. Police officers occupy positions that require public confidence. They make arrests. They prepare investigative reports. They testify under oath. Their credibility often becomes an essential component of criminal prosecutions. Because of that responsibility, prosecutors have legal obligations to disclose certain information that could bear upon the credibility of officers who serve as witnesses in criminal cases. Whether particular communications triggered those obligations depended upon the facts of individual cases, but the possibility alone required careful review. That review expanded quickly. Every case involving officers connected to the messages had to be examined individually. Which officer participated? What role had that officer played? Did the officer author reports? Did the officer testify? Was the officer expected to testify in future proceedings? Each answer generated additional work. The discovery that began with one investigation now affected matters reaching far beyond its original scope. Defense attorneys also recognized the potential significance of the recovered communications. In the American legal system, the credibility of a witness can influence the outcome of an entire trial. When the witness is a police officer whose testimony supports criminal charges, questions regarding impartiality or professional conduct may become legally relevant. As court proceedings progressed, some of the communications entered the public record through litigation. Journalists began reviewing those filings. Legal reporters compared court documents with statements issued by public officials. Gradually, the existence of the messaging scandal moved from internal investigative files into newspaper articles, television reports, and public discussion. For many residents of Torrance, this was the first indication that the investigation had uncovered something far more significant than originally reported. The headlines were unsettling. Not because they described a single controversial arrest or one disputed use of force incident. Instead, they suggested that private communications among multiple officers had raised broader questions concerning departmental culture and professional standards. The public reaction reflected both concern and uncertainty. Residents wanted answers. How extensive were the communications? How many officers were involved? How long had the conversations continued? Had supervisors been aware of any warning signs? Could similar issues exist elsewhere? Those questions could not be answered immediately. Investigations involving public employees require due process. Evidence must be evaluated carefully. Individual responsibility cannot simply be assumed because a person appears within a group conversation. Administrative findings depend upon documented facts rather than speculation. Even so, the broader implications were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The recovered messages also renewed attention to earlier incidents involving the department. Among the most widely discussed was the 2018 fatal police shooting of Christopher DeAndre Mitchell. During subsequent legal proceedings connected to the messaging investigation, Some communications referring to Mitchell's family following public demonstrations became part of the record. Those disclosures intensified public criticism because they appeared inconsistent with the professionalism expected of law enforcement officers. For Mitchell's family and others who had already questioned aspects of the department's conduct, the newly disclosed communications carried emotional weight that extended beyond legal procedure. For others, the revelations prompted broader reflection. Public institutions depend upon confidence that official authority will be exercised fairly. When questions arise concerning impartiality, restoring that confidence can prove far more difficult than losing it. The legal consequences soon became substantial. Prosecutors throughout Los Angeles County undertook reviews of cases involving officers connected to the communications. Some criminal matters required additional disclosures. Certain cases were re-evaluated. Defense attorneys sought access to information that might bear upon witness credibility. Each case required its own legal analysis because the facts, participants, and evidentiary issues differed. No single ruling resolved every question. Instead, the justice system addressed the consequences incrementally, one proceeding at a time. The administrative consequences also continued to unfold. Internal investigations examined whether departmental policies had been violated. According to publicly reported information, approximately 15 officers came under internal review, while several officers ultimately left the department or were placed on administrative leave during the years that followed. Those personnel developments reflected only part of the broader picture. Attention increasingly shifted toward institutional oversight. Community organizations asked whether existing supervisory systems had been sufficient. Legal scholars discussed the relationship between private communications and public responsibility. Civil rights advocates argued that stronger accountability mechanisms were necessary to maintain public trust. Meanwhile, city leaders faced growing pressure to explain how such communications could remain undiscovered until an unrelated criminal investigation brought them to light. The controversy spread beyond Torrance. Law enforcement agencies elsewhere observed the developments closely. The case illustrated how modern digital evidence can reshape investigations in unexpected ways. A routine forensic examination had uncovered communications that affected criminal prosecutions, administrative proceedings, civil litigation, and ultimately statewide oversight. Few investigations produce consequences reaching so many different parts of the justice system. The discovery also demonstrated an important reality about digital communication. Private messages often feel temporary. People type quickly. They assume conversations remain confined to a small audience. Yet electronic records possess extraordinary permanence. Years later, they may be reconstructed with remarkable accuracy. What appears private today may become evidence tomorrow. For investigators, that permanence can reveal patterns impossible to detect through witness interviews alone. For institutions, it serves as a reminder that organizational culture often leaves digital traces. By late 2021, the significance of the controversy had grown sufficiently that the California Attorney General's office initiated an independent civil rights investigation into the Torrance Police Department. That review would examine policies, practices, supervision, accountability systems, and broader institutional issues extending well beyond the individual messages themselves. The discovery had now evolved into something much larger. It was no longer solely about offensive communications recovered from electronic devices. It had become an examination of how an institution functioned, how oversight operated, and whether existing safeguards adequately protected the public's confidence in law enforcement. Years would pass before the investigation reached its conclusion. Court proceedings would continue. Civil lawsuits would be filed. Policy discussions would intensify. Public debate would remain active. But the turning point had already occurred. It happened quietly. Inside forensic laboratories. within carefully reconstructed message histories, through evidence that investigators had not originally expected to find. The phones had revealed more than conversations. They had revealed questions that would reshape the future of an entire police department. And those questions were only beginning to be answered. The discovery of the text messages did not end the investigation. It transformed it. What had begun as an inquiry into allegations involving two officers was no longer confined to a single incident, a single report, or a single set of allegations. Investigators now faced a far more complex challenge, determining not only what had been written, but what those communications meant within the broader operation of a police department entrusted with enforcing the law. In any investigation involving public officials, facts must be separated from assumptions. Electronic messages, standing alone, do not automatically establish misconduct in every aspect of an officer's work. Investigators could not simply conclude that inappropriate language in private communications had influenced every arrest, every report, or every courtroom testimony. Each question required evidence. Each conclusion required documentation. That principle shaped everything that followed. The review expanded in multiple directions at once. Administrative investigators began examining whether departmental policies governing professional conduct had been violated. Prosecutors assessed whether the recovered communications created legal disclosure obligations in criminal cases. City attorneys evaluated potential civil liability. Defense lawyers sought access to information that could bear upon the credibility of officers expected to testify. Each group approached the evidence from a different legal perspective, yet all were examining the same underlying issue. Could private communications undermine public confidence in official actions? The answer could not be reached through headlines alone. It required painstaking work. Investigators reconstructed timelines. Message threads were reviewed in context rather than as isolated screenshots. Participants were identified. Dates were compared with official records. Every recovered communication had to be evaluated carefully. Who authored the message? Who received it? Who responded? Who remained silent? Even silence required careful interpretation. Being included in a group conversation did not necessarily mean endorsing every statement made within it. Administrative investigators therefore distinguished between participation, authorship, and individual responsibility rather than treating every person identically. That distinction mattered. Public attention often seeks simple answers. Investigations rarely provide them. As the review continued, approximately 15 officers were reported to have come under internal investigation, while more than a dozen were publicly identified through court proceedings or related reporting as participants in various message exchanges. Each officer's circumstances differed. Administrative investigations are designed to evaluate individual conduct rather than collective assumptions. Some personnel decisions occurred while investigations remained ongoing. Several officers eventually left the department. Others were placed on administrative leave. Those actions reflected employment decisions occurring over an extended period rather than a single coordinated disciplinary event. Outside the department, another review had already begun. Prosecutors faced a responsibility unique to the American criminal justice system. Police officers do not merely investigate crimes. They frequently become witnesses. Their reports help establish probable cause. Their testimony influences judges and juries. Their credibility can become central to criminal prosecutions. When information arises that may affect an officer's credibility, prosecutors must evaluate whether that information should be disclosed in cases where the officer serves as a witness. The legal analysis is highly fact-specific. Different cases present different issues. Not every communication automatically affects every prosecution. Nevertheless, the recovered messages required prosecutors to undertake a substantial review. Hundreds of criminal cases potentially required examination. Files were reopened. Witness lists were reviewed. Court calendars changed. Defense attorneys received additional disclosures in appropriate cases. The process demanded enormous resources. For prosecutors, the challenge extended beyond legal compliance. Public confidence in the justice system depends upon fairness. Reviewing affected cases demonstrated that credibility concerns would not simply be ignored. Defense attorneys approached the situation from another direction. Their duty is to represent the interests of their clients vigorously within the law. If an officer connected to a criminal case had participated in communications raising questions about bias or professional judgment, defense counsel could argue that such information was relevant to evaluating witness credibility. Some cases generated motions. Others prompted additional hearings. Still others resulted in negotiations influenced by the evolving legal landscape. Every case proceeded according to its own facts. No single judicial decision resolved every issue created by the investigation. Instead, the courts addressed questions individually, one proceeding at a time. Meanwhile, journalists continued examining public records. Court filings revealed additional details as litigation progressed. Each newly released document attracted renewed attention. Legal commentators analyzed developments. Community organizations demanded transparency. Residents attended public meetings seeking reassurance that the issues uncovered would be addressed comprehensively rather than treated as isolated personnel matters. By this stage, the focus had shifted. The investigation was no longer asking only what individual officers had written. It was asking whether institutional safeguards had functioned effectively. How had concerns been identified? Were warning signs missed? Did supervisory systems adequately detect inappropriate conduct? Were existing policies sufficient for an era in which workplace culture increasingly extended into digital communication? Those questions pointed toward something larger than discipline. They pointed toward organizational culture. Culture cannot be measured through a single message. Nor can it be understood solely by reading policy manuals. It emerges through repeated patterns of behavior. Through what supervisors tolerate. Through what colleagues challenge. Through what organizations reward. Through what organizations ignore. Understanding culture therefore required investigators to look beyond individual conversations. They examined training, supervision, accountability mechanisms, complaint procedures, internal review processes. The objective was not simply to determine what had happened in the past but to assess whether structural improvements were necessary to reduce future risk. Public concern intensified further because the messaging investigation intersected with earlier controversies involving the department. Among the most significant was the 2018 fatal police shooting of Christopher DeAndre Mitchell. During subsequent litigation, certain communications concerning Mitchell's family after public demonstrations became part of the public record. Those disclosures deepened community concern because they appeared inconsistent with expectations that officers maintain professionalism even when discussing controversial incidents privately. Again, investigators distinguished between documented communications and conclusions regarding official conduct. The investigation did not assume that every inappropriate message translated directly into discriminatory policing. Nevertheless, the existence of such communications raised legitimate questions concerning public confidence, impartiality, and institutional accountability. Those questions extended beyond taunts. Across California, law enforcement agencies observed the developments carefully. The controversy demonstrated how advances in digital forensic technology had changed internal investigations. Years earlier, many conversations occurring between colleagues might have disappeared without leaving a record. Smartphones altered that reality. Electronic communication preserves history. Messages once viewed as informal can later become evidence. That permanence has transformed both criminal investigations and administrative oversight. As attention continued to grow, the California Attorney General's office initiated an independent civil rights investigation in late 2021 under its authority to examine patterns or practices within law enforcement agencies. The announcement marked a significant turning point. The inquiry would extend beyond individual personnel matters. State investigators examined whether broader patterns existed concerning policies, supervision, accountability, and compliance with constitutional policing standards. Independent investigations of this nature require extensive review. Investigators analyze policies, interview personnel, review training materials, examine complaint histories, evaluate supervisory structures, assess whether reforms are necessary to protect constitutional rights and strengthen public trust. The process unfolds over months and often years. It is methodical rather than dramatic. While the Attorney General's investigation progressed, the department itself continued operating. Officers continued responding to emergency calls. Criminal investigations continued. Community policing initiatives continued. The city still required law enforcement services every day. That reality created a difficult balance. Public institutions cannot simply stop functioning while investigations proceed. Yet they must also address legitimate concerns raised by the investigations themselves. Maintaining that balance became one of the department's greatest challenges. Community meetings reflected the complexity of public opinion. Some residents emphasized that many officers served honorably and should not be judged by the actions of others. Others argued that meaningful accountability required examining institutional culture rather than focusing solely upon individuals. Many agreed on one point. Public confidence had been shaken. Rebuilding it would require transparency, accountability, and sustained effort over time. The investigation had now entered a new phase. The initial discovery was complete. The evidence had been collected. The questions had been identified. Now came the more difficult task. Determining how a police department, and the broader justice system surrounding it, should respond when private communications raise public concerns about fairness, professionalism, and trust. The answers would not emerge quickly. They would take years of legal proceedings, administrative review, independent oversight, and public debate. Only then would California announce a comprehensive framework for reform that sought not only to address the past, but also to reshape the future of policing in Torrance. By the time the investigation entered its second year, one reality had become impossible to ignore. This was no longer simply an internal personnel matter. The discovery of the messages had already altered criminal prosecutions, prompted internal investigations, and generated widespread public concern. Yet investigators and state officials increasingly recognized that examining individual conduct alone would not answer the larger question confronting the city of Torrance. The question had evolved. It was no longer, what did these officers write? It had become, what does this reveal about the systems responsible for preventing, detecting, and correcting misconduct? That shift marked the true breakthrough in the investigation. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, prosecutors continued reviewing criminal cases involving officers connected to the recovered communications. Each file required individual analysis. Investigators and attorneys examined whether officers had served as arresting officers, prepared reports, testified in court, or otherwise played significant roles in criminal prosecutions. The review demanded patience. There was no shortcut. Every criminal case represents the rights of real people, victims seeking justice, defendants entitled to fair proceedings, witnesses whose testimony may determine outcomes, and communities relying upon confidence in the legal process. Because of those competing interests, decisions could not be made collectively. Each case stood on its own facts. Some prosecutions moved forward without interruption. Others required additional disclosure to defense counsel. In certain matters, courts considered arguments concerning witness credibility. The legal process unfolded gradually, reflecting the complexity of balancing accountability with due process. Outside the courtroom, investigative reporting continued expanding public understanding of the controversy. Journalists reviewed court filings, interviewed legal experts, and examined publicly available records. As additional information entered the public domain, the conversation surrounding the scandal began changing. Early coverage had focused primarily on the offensive nature of the messages themselves. Increasingly, however, attention shifted toward broader institutional questions. How had these communications remained undiscovered until an unrelated criminal investigation? What supervisory mechanisms existed? Were complaint systems functioning effectively? Did departmental culture discourage employees from reporting inappropriate conduct? Those questions extended beyond the actions of individual officers. They addressed the health of the institution itself. Civil rights organizations echoed similar concerns. Their focus was not limited to isolated communications. Instead, they argued that public confidence required examining whether organizational policies adequately protected constitutional rights and ensured equal treatment under the law. Community members voiced comparable concerns during public meetings. Residents asked city officials difficult questions. What reforms were being considered? Would independent oversight be implemented? How would trust be rebuilt? The answers were still developing. Meanwhile, the legal consequences continued to expand. Civil lawsuits alleging violations of constitutional rights and discriminatory treatment added another dimension to the controversy. Each lawsuit involved its own factual allegations and legal arguments, but collectively they reinforced the growing perception that the issues extended beyond isolated misconduct. The financial implications also became increasingly apparent. Litigation required significant public resources. Legal defense costs increased. Settlement discussions emerged in various matters. Although financial consequences alone cannot measure institutional damage, they illustrated that the controversy carried practical effects alongside reputational ones. Yet the most significant development was still approaching. In late 2021, the California Attorney General's office announced an independent civil rights investigation into the Torrance Police Department. That announcement represented a turning point unlike any previous stage of the case. The inquiry was not limited to determining whether specific officers had violated departmental policies. Instead, state investigators examined whether broader patterns or practices within the department raised concerns under California law. Independent investigations of this nature are comprehensive. Investigators review written policies, training materials, complaint procedures, internal disciplinary systems, supervisory practices, accountability mechanisms, records concerning use of force, processes governing officer conduct. The objective is not simply to identify isolated failures but to determine whether structural improvements are necessary. That distinction mattered enormously. Individual discipline addresses past conduct. Institutional reform seeks to reduce future risk. For many observers, the Attorney General's involvement confirmed that the controversy had reached a level requiring oversight beyond local government. The investigation proceeded over several years. State investigators conducted interviews, reviewed documents, analyzed departmental practices, examined how complaints were received and investigated, evaluated whether existing safeguards adequately protected the rights of community members. The work attracted far less public attention than dramatic headlines, but it proved essential. Meaningful reform rarely occurs through emotion alone. It depends upon evidence. Recommendations. Implementation. Oversight. As the state review continued, Torrance Police Department also undertook changes within its own organization. Personnel changes occurred. Policies were revised. Training initiatives expanded. Those efforts reflected ongoing responses to issues identified during the investigations. At the same time, many officers who had no connection to the messaging controversy continued performing their daily responsibilities. Emergency calls did not stop. Traffic collisions still occurred. Victims still required assistance. Criminal investigations still had to be conducted. That reality illustrated another challenge confronting any institution under investigation. Public service cannot simply pause while reforms are developed. Communities continue relying upon essential services even during periods of institutional uncertainty. For officers working professionally throughout the controversy, rebuilding confidence became part of everyday policing. Every interaction with the public carried additional significance. Professionalism had to be demonstrated consistently rather than assumed. Trust would return, if at all, through repeated actions rather than public statements. By 2025, the lengthy state investigation reached its conclusion. The California Attorney General announced an enforceable agreement with the City of Torrance and the Torrance Police Department designed to address the issues identified during the review. The agreement outlined substantial reforms rather than symbolic gestures. Among its principal components were enhanced independent oversight, improvements to accountability systems, revisions to policies and procedures, strengthened supervision, expanded anti-bias training, and measures intended to improve transparency and community confidence. Unlike voluntary recommendations, the agreement carried legal force. Implementation would be monitored. Progress would be evaluated. Compliance would be expected. For many legal observers, this represented the investigation's most significant breakthrough. The focus had shifted decisively from reacting to past events toward preventing similar problems in the future. No reform agreement can erase what has already occurred. It cannot restore confidence overnight. Nor can it answer every question raised by years of litigation and public debate. But it can establish mechanisms intended to reduce future failures. The broader significance of the Torrance investigation extended well beyond one California city. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized that organizational culture could no longer be viewed solely through formal policies or official statements. Digital communication had changed the landscape. Private conversations could become public evidence. Institutional accountability now required greater attention to conduct occurring both inside and outside traditional workplace settings. The case also underscored an enduring principle of democratic government. Public authority carries public responsibility. Police officers exercise extraordinary powers granted by society. They may detain individuals, use force under limited legal circumstances, conduct investigations, present evidence in court. Those responsibilities require corresponding standards of professionalism and accountability. When questions arise concerning those standards, the justice system must respond carefully, fairly, and transparently. That response formed the central achievement of the investigation. Not because every controversy disappeared. Not because every disagreement ended. But because the inquiry evolved from examining individual communications to evaluating institutional systems capable of shaping the future. The breakthrough was never a single recovered message. It was the recognition that lasting public trust depends not only upon identifying misconduct after it occurs, but upon building structures designed to prevent it in the first place. That realization would shape everything that followed. The courtroom battles were still unfolding. Civil litigation would continue. Public debate would remain active. Yet one chapter of the story had reached its conclusion. The investigation had moved beyond discovery, beyond exposure, beyond individual accountability. It had become a blueprint for institutional reform, one intended to restore confidence in a department whose greatest challenge was no longer solving crimes, but rebuilding the trust that allows justice itself to function. Justice is often imagined as a single moment. A courtroom falls silent. A judge enters. A verdict is read. Someone walks away in handcuffs. The story ends. Real life is rarely that simple. The Torrance text message scandal did not lead to one dramatic criminal trial that resolved every question. Instead, its consequences unfolded across multiple courtrooms, administrative proceedings, civil lawsuits, and years of legal review. There was no single defendant standing before one jury. There was no single verdict capable of answering every concern raised by the investigation. The pursuit of justice became something much broader. It became a test of whether the legal system itself could respond when confidence in law enforcement had been shaken. As prosecutors continued reviewing criminal cases involving officers connected to the recovered communications, each decision required careful legal analysis. The justice system does not permit sweeping assumptions. Every criminal prosecution rests upon its own evidence. Every defendant possesses constitutional rights. Every victim deserves a fair process. Every witness must be evaluated according to the facts of the particular case. That meant prosecutors could not simply declare hundreds of convictions invalid because offensive messages had been discovered. Nor could they ignore information that might bear upon the credibility of officers serving as witnesses. Instead, the law required something more difficult. Individual review. Case after case. File after file. One courtroom at a time. Some prosecutions required additional disclosures to defense attorneys. Others prompted hearings concerning witness credibility. Certain cases were re-examined because officers connected to the messages had participated in investigations or testified during legal proceedings. In some instances, criminal matters were dismissed or otherwise affected as prosecutors reassessed the strength of cases involving officers whose credibility had become the subject of public scrutiny. Each outcome depended upon the unique facts and legal issues presented in that particular case. The process was deliberate rather than dramatic. For defense attorneys, the scandal reinforced a fundamental principle of American justice. The government's evidence must withstand scrutiny. Police officers, like all witnesses, may be questioned regarding credibility when legally appropriate. Defense lawyers examined court records, requested relevant disclosures, and argued that juries should have access to information bearing upon the reliability of testimony presented against their clients. Their role was not to determine guilt or innocence. It was to ensure that constitutional protections remained meaningful. Judges, meanwhile, occupied perhaps the most difficult position of all. Courts could not allow public controversy alone to determine legal outcomes. Decisions had to remain grounded in evidence, procedural law, and established legal standards. Every motion required careful consideration. Every ruling required explanation. Justice demanded neither panic nor complacency. It demanded balance. Outside the criminal courts, civil litigation continued moving through the legal system. Individuals alleged violations of constitutional rights, discrimination, and other forms of misconduct. Each lawsuit proceeded independently. Some cases advanced toward trial. Others concluded through settlement. Civil proceedings differ from criminal prosecutions in both purpose and procedure. Rather than determining criminal guilt, they often examine whether governmental conduct violated legal rights and whether compensation or other remedies are appropriate. Together, these lawsuits reflected the broader impact of the controversy. The consequences extended beyond individual officers. They affected public institutions. Municipal finances. Community confidence. The relationship between government and the people it serves. Within the Torrance Police Department itself, administrative accountability followed a separate course. Employment investigations differ from criminal proceedings. Departments evaluate whether employees complied with professional standards, internal policies, and ethical obligations. Publicly reported information indicated that approximately 15 officers came under internal investigation in connection with the recovered communications. Over time, several officers left the department or were placed on administrative leave. Personnel decisions unfolded across multiple years rather than through one sweeping disciplinary action. Administrative processes are often less visible than courtroom proceedings. Personnel laws protect certain aspects of employment investigations. As a result, many decisions occur outside public view. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The department was changing. Personnel changed. Leadership faced new expectations. Policies underwent revision. Training expanded. Oversight increased. Still, many observers argued that personnel actions alone could not resolve the deeper issues raised by the investigation. The central question remained: how could public trust be restored? That question ultimately reached the California Attorney General's office. Following its multi-year civil rights investigation, the Attorney General concluded that comprehensive institutional reform was necessary. In August 2025, California announced an enforceable agreement with the City of Torrance and the Torrance Police Department. Unlike a press conference or policy recommendation, the agreement carried legal significance. It established binding commitments designed to strengthen accountability and improve policing practices. The reforms addressed multiple areas identified during the investigation. Independent oversight mechanisms would increase external review. Policies governing officer conduct would be strengthened. Training concerning bias, professionalism, and constitutional policing would be expanded. Supervisory responsibilities would receive greater emphasis. Complaint systems would be improved. Transparency measures would be enhanced. Implementation would be monitored over time. The agreement recognized an important reality. Justice does not always consist of punishment. Sometimes justice requires reform. Sometimes preventing future harm becomes as important as addressing past mistakes. For many community members, however, the legal agreement represented only one part of a much larger journey. Families who had questioned earlier police encounters continued seeking reassurance that meaningful change would occur. Residents wanted evidence rather than promises. Community organizations emphasized that trust would return only through consistent action. Public confidence cannot be restored by a single announcement. It grows slowly. Interaction after interaction. Year after year. The scandal also carried consequences beyond Torrance. Police departments across California and throughout the United States observed the case closely. The investigation demonstrated how digital evidence could expose organizational culture in ways previously unimaginable. Private group messages, once assumed to remain unseen, had become central evidence in a statewide civil rights investigation. Departments increasingly recognized the importance of policies governing electronic communication, professional conduct, and supervisory accountability. Technology had changed policing. It had also changed oversight. Every electronic message possessed the potential to become part of the historical record. That realization influenced training programs far beyond Southern California. Legal scholars likewise viewed the case as significant. The controversy illustrated the intersection of constitutional rights, prosecutorial disclosure obligations, police credibility, employment law, civil rights enforcement, and institutional reform. Rarely does one investigation touch so many different areas of the justice system simultaneously. Perhaps that is why the story resisted simple conclusions. There was no single courtroom victory. No final verdict ending every debate. No closing scene in which every question received a satisfying answer. Instead, justice emerged through institutions performing different roles. Investigators uncovered evidence. Prosecutors reviewed cases. Defense attorneys asserted constitutional protections. Judges applied the law. Journalists informed the public. Community members demanded accountability. State officials implemented reforms. Each played a different part. Together, they demonstrated that accountability within a democratic society seldom depends upon one individual or one institution alone. It depends upon many systems working together. Even then, the process remains imperfect. Some residents believed the reforms represented meaningful progress. Others argued they did not go far enough. Reasonable people continued disagreeing about particular decisions, legal outcomes, and institutional responsibility. Such disagreement is not unusual. Public accountability often generates debate precisely because the issues involved are so important. Yet one conclusion attracted far broader agreement. The discovery of the messages fundamentally changed the conversation surrounding policing in Torrance. It prompted reviews that otherwise would not have occurred. It encouraged greater examination of institutional culture. It resulted in legally enforceable reforms designed to strengthen public confidence. Most importantly, it reminded both law enforcement and the communities they serve that legitimacy depends upon more than authority. It depends upon integrity. Because every badge carries extraordinary power. And with extraordinary power comes an equally extraordinary obligation. Not simply to enforce the law, but to earn, every day, the trust that allows the law to function at all. The legal battles would gradually conclude. Policies would continue evolving. New officers would join the department. Others would retire. Years from now, many people may forget the names associated with the investigation. But the lessons it produced will remain. That is the lasting measure of justice. Not merely what happened after the scandal, but what changed because of it. When the headlines begin to fade, the real consequences begin. News cycles move quickly. One week, a story dominates television broadcasts and newspaper front pages. The next, another crisis takes its place. Cameras leave. Satellite trucks disappear. Reporters move on to the next investigation. Communities do not. For the people of Torrance, the text message scandal did not simply end because fewer articles were being published. The questions it raised continued to shape conversations long after the initial wave of public attention had passed. Trust, once damaged, does not return on a schedule. It does not recover because a legal agreement has been signed. It does not heal because officials announce new policies. Trust returns only when people begin believing that tomorrow will be different from yesterday. That process is slow. Sometimes painfully slow. The Torrance Police Department continued doing what every police department must do. Emergency calls still came in every hour of every day. Traffic accidents still blocked busy intersections. Families still reported missing relatives. Businesses still called when alarms sounded after midnight. Officers still responded to domestic disputes where frightened children waited behind bedroom doors. Crime did not pause while reforms were implemented. Neither did the responsibility carried by those wearing the badge. Many officers serving during this period had no connection whatsoever to the communications that sparked the scandal. Some had joined the department after the messages had already been exchanged. Others had built careers without disciplinary issues. Yet every one of them inherited the consequences. That is one of the realities of institutional trust. A reputation belongs to everyone inside the organization, not only to those who created it. For officers working honestly, rebuilding confidence became part of every interaction. Every traffic stop required additional patience. Every conversation with a witness carried greater importance. Every neighborhood meeting became another opportunity to demonstrate professionalism through actions rather than promises. The burden was significant. Public confidence cannot distinguish between individuals as easily as legal proceedings can. Institutions are judged collectively. That collective judgment affected the department in ways impossible to calculate through statistics alone. Recruitment became part of the conversation. Across the United States, many law enforcement agencies have faced increasing challenges attracting qualified applicants. Public controversy often adds another layer of difficulty. Young men and women considering careers in policing naturally ask themselves difficult questions. What kind of department am I joining? What culture exists there? Will I receive proper mentorship? Will professionalism truly be expected? Those questions matter because organizational culture is shaped not only by experienced officers but also by those who choose to become the next generation of law enforcement professionals. Leadership understood that rebuilding confidence required attracting people committed to constitutional policing, ethical decision-making, and respectful service. Policy changes alone could not accomplish that objective. Culture develops through people. Training can establish expectations. Supervision can reinforce standards. But individuals ultimately determine whether those standards become daily practice. The scandal also changed how electronic communication was viewed within many law enforcement agencies. Years earlier, text messages often felt informal. Group chats resembled conversations occurring inside break rooms or patrol cars. Technology blurred the distinction between personal and professional communication. The Torrance investigation demonstrated that digital conversations could later become evidence with significant legal consequences. Departments across the country increasingly recognized that professionalism extends beyond public appearances. Private communication among public officials may eventually become subject to legal review. That lesson reached beyond policing. Public servants in many professions reconsidered how electronic communication should reflect professional responsibilities. The controversy also influenced discussions concerning transparency. Community organizations argued that accountability requires more than responding after misconduct is discovered. They emphasized the importance of systems capable of identifying problems before they become public scandals. Independent oversight. Accessible complaint procedures. Clear reporting mechanisms. Regular policy review. Meaningful supervision. These concepts became central to conversations extending well beyond Torrance. The California Attorney General's enforceable agreement represented one step toward addressing those concerns. Its implementation required sustained commitment rather than symbolic action. Independent monitoring would evaluate progress. Policy revisions would require practical application. Training programs would need reinforcement through supervision and accountability. Institutional reform is rarely measured in months. Its success becomes apparent only over years. Whether confidence grows depends not upon written policies alone but upon consistent experience within the community. Residents notice patterns. They remember how they are treated during ordinary encounters. Respect cannot be legislated. It must be demonstrated repeatedly. The legal system also continued absorbing the effects of the investigation. Cases reviewed during the controversy became part of broader discussions concerning prosecutorial disclosure obligations and witness credibility. Law schools examined the issues. Legal conferences discussed the implications. Scholars analyzing constitutional policing frequently cited the investigation as an example of how institutional culture can intersect with criminal procedure. The case therefore became more than a local controversy. It became part of national conversations about accountability in modern policing. Journalists likewise continued revisiting the story as new developments occurred. Each update reminded readers that institutional reform is an ongoing process rather than a single event. Public attention may fluctuate. Implementation continues regardless. The broader American conversation surrounding policing also evolved during these years. Communities across the country continued debating questions of transparency, public safety, accountability, and constitutional rights. The Torrance case became one example among many illustrating how digital evidence, public oversight, and civil rights enforcement increasingly intersect. No department operates in isolation. Lessons learned in one jurisdiction often influence policy elsewhere. Perhaps the most enduring consequence involved perception. Before the investigation, many residents viewed professionalism largely through visible actions. Uniforms, patrol vehicles, emergency response times, community outreach events. After the scandal, many people began asking additional questions. How does an organization supervise itself? How are complaints investigated? What systems exist to detect misconduct? Who reviews those systems? What happens when failures occur? Those questions reflected a deeper understanding of accountability. Strong institutions are not defined by the absence of mistakes. They are defined by how they respond when mistakes are discovered. For community members who had long advocated greater oversight, the investigation represented acknowledgement that their concerns deserved serious examination. For others who had never questioned the department previously, the revelations served as a reminder that public trust requires continual maintenance rather than unquestioning acceptance. Both perspectives shaped the city's future. Years from now, many residents may not remember every legal filing or every policy revision. Few people memorize the details of administrative agreements. What communities remember instead is whether everyday experience gradually improved. Whether officers listened respectfully. Whether complaints received fair review. Whether neighborhoods felt both safe and fairly treated. Those experiences ultimately define institutional legitimacy far more than official documents. The Torrance story also offered an important lesson about technology. The messages recovered during the investigation had been written privately. Their authors did not expect them to become public. Yet digital communication rarely disappears completely. Modern forensic methods preserve history in extraordinary detail. That reality has changed investigations everywhere. It has also changed expectations. Professional conduct is no longer evaluated only through public behavior. Electronic communication can become part of the historical record. Future generations of officers will likely receive training shaped in part by that lesson. The scandal therefore occupies an unusual place in California's law enforcement history. It was not defined by one arrest. Not by one pursuit. Not by one courtroom verdict. Instead, it demonstrated how organizational culture, technology, constitutional law, and public confidence can converge within a single investigation. Its impact reached beyond the officers whose communications became public. Beyond the department. Beyond Torrance itself. It influenced legal practice, public policy, training, oversight, community expectations, and perhaps that is the most significant legacy. Institutions are built over decades. Their reputations grow through thousands of routine decisions made quietly, often unnoticed. Yet they can be fundamentally challenged by evidence revealing that private conduct and public responsibility have drifted apart. The aftermath of the Torrance text message scandal was therefore not measured solely by investigations completed or reforms implemented. It was measured by an ongoing effort to close that gap. to ensure that the values presented to the public are the same values practiced when no one believes they are being watched. Because in the end, accountability is not about what people say under public scrutiny. It is about the choices they make when they believe no one else will ever know. The phones revealed those choices. The investigation exposed them. The reforms sought to address them. Whether those reforms ultimately restore lasting public confidence is a question that only time, and the everyday experiences of the people of Torrance, can answer.